Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit today about point count surveys with distance sampling. And the first thing I recommend is that you do spend some time doing a good scouting trip before you start your survey. Use that trip to establish your points. You're going to be selecting 10 points in 2 different kinds of habitats. 2 habitats where you really think you'd see differences in the birds there, not just the types of birds, but the numbers. And then you're going to select points that are at least 200 meters apart from one another. But aside from that, we don't have a lot of parameters on where you're selecting these points. If we were doing some kind of research project, we would need to be implementing some kind of a random process into the establishment of the points. But for this, for the practice's purposes, for practicing doing a point count, you can pick where you'd like your points to be as long as they're far enough away from each other. Once you do that, you can spend some time getting familiar with your site. That's what's so great about a scouting trip. And you can also knock out some of the data collection, namely your habitat data. And you can actually do a little bit other data collection. We'll touch on that as well. So you'll write down your point number, the identifier for your point, the latitude, the longitude in decimal degrees, your elevation in meters, all of which you can get from a GPS app on your phone or from some GIS program like Google Earth. And then you're going to describe your habitat. Usually you're in one kind of habitat and you're looking at a 50-meter radius around yourself. And if you're in one uniform kind of habitat, even if it's a variable part of it, say it's an old growth forest, not everything around you across 50 meters is going to look exactly the same, but it's still old growth forest. So you'll write the habitat down and its percent coverage. Every now and then you might be on the edge of some other different habitat, so the edge of, say, a deciduous or a coniferous forest, and that's within 50 meters of you. So if there's a second kind of habitat within that 50-meter radius, you can describe it and give its coverage. There are fields here for if you're near standing water or if you're near a stream, to put some information down for those as well. If within 100 meters of you, you have an adjacent land use, a farm or some other, a green space or something is within 100 meters, then you will just list what that is, the adjacent land use. And then if you're near, specifically if you're near a road or a tree fall, a large tree fall gap, and again, within 100 meters, just write that down and then mention what it is. The first sort of less descriptive type of data you're going to write is the number of habitat layers. And I'm going to describe this for a forest because then it makes it kind of easier to understand for the different kinds of habitats. If you're in a forest, you can have up to 4 habitat layers. And you really think of these as vertical layers in the environment, starting with a canopy. So you may have a canopy of trees that are over 100 feet high. It can be even taller if you're in an old growth forest. And so I think of a lot of areas on the Evergreen campus where you're in there and there are a number of very, very tall trees in that environment. So that's the layer 1. Some people start from the ground, but I like to start from the top. Layer 1, and you will estimate the height of that canopy and how much of it, what it's covering, how much of the space above you there is coverage, and we'll go into that in a minute. There may be a secondary canopy. And again, I often see this, say, in the evergreen forest with some coniferous, if you're in a mixed coniferous deciduous stand, you have some really tall coniferous trees. And then lower, maybe 50 feet high, you have some alders, a substantial number of them, making it the secondary canopy that's part of the forest. So you'll estimate its height and coverage. There's often a shrub layer. And so this would count as something that's like a shrub layer, even though it's kind of a tree. So shrubby vegetation that does not reach the level of the canopy, but is taller than 1 meter. It's shrubby, usually woody vegetation, but sword fern in some areas forms this kind of shrubby layer as well, okay, even though it's not technically woody vegetation. And then, so that's the 3rd layer, and then you may have an herbaceous ground cover, okay, and so you'll write some information about these layers. You're going to write how many there are. Sometimes you only have 1 layer. Sometimes you have all 4, and you may have things in between. And for each layer that you have, you're going to mention it, discuss its height and its percent coverage. For the shrub layer, you're going to talk about its maximum height. How high does the shrubby layer get in this area? And this is a little bit subjective, but you can usually see it when you're in an environment like this. This is that layer of hollies and huckleberries and slaw that is above your waist, but not reaching the canopy, okay? And so you estimate your average height for that area around 50 meters of yourself, and also give a percent coverage. And then for ground, you don't estimate the height. You just give a percent coverage for herbaceous ground layer. And then the final thing you're doing is you're looking at live stems. And I did have a ruler with me a second ago. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, let's see if this has a ruler in it that will suffice. Yes. Okay, great. This is the great thing I love about field notebooks. Is we're going to be counting stems. So within 50 meters, we're going to do stem counts of relatively large stems. That is living trees that are at least 15 centimeters in diameter at breast height. And breast height is a standard height. I honestly don't remember if it's 1.2 or 1.5 meters, but it's basically right at the area of your sternum. Okay, well, sternum, somewhere around your chest. Okay, and so you look at that diameter, and you can actually hold up a ruler and make those estimates, so you can walk over to the trees. And again, this is not a circumference measure, it's a diameter measure. And so you do that for living stems, living trees. So you count all the ones that are at least 15 centimeters diameter or larger, and the same for standing dead trees, also called snags. The final piece of information you collect is number of logs in the environment that are at least 15 centimeters at their widest point and at least 1 meter long. Okay, so you might bring a tape measure with you, use your field notebook or a ruler with you to help you gather those estimates. Once you get a very good feel for that and these distances 50 meters away and this sort of thing, it becomes easier to collect that information. The first few plots usually go slower. So now you've actually collected your habitat data. You can then start to collect data on your point count sheet. I wouldn't do a survey. You don't do a survey because this is the scouting trip, but you could fill out the top part of your sheets. You then have to keep them organized and maybe bring a few extras in case you lose some, but it never hurts. Or if you're doing this in your field notebook, like some of these are in here, it's pretty easy to keep track of them. You just number them from the first to the last, and you enter basic weather information and habitat, not habitat, but location and weather information in for each survey, and you do that the day of the survey. But you can start to draw a map on your survey sheet. And so the first thing I do when I'm doing this is I find north, and I've looked through a compass. You can use a compass on your phone. You can use a sun compass, knowing that in the middle of the day, this time of year, say at 12 noon, the sun is in the south, okay? And then you can do that depending on other times of day. If you're at dawn, the sun's in the east, etc. But you can use a compass on your phone. Find north, and I actually draw north, east, south, and west on my map. And then I start to note landmarks. And first I just name what they are. If it's a house or a huge snag or an upturned tree, I name probably about 10 landmarks, usually close to me and far from me. So I have a close to me band and a far from me band. And then sometimes I even note some things that are way far out. Like if there's a road that's really further than I would say about 50 meters or so here. And so I note those down. And I measure their distances. So again, this is the scouting trip. You can take all this time. You're not losing time doing bird surveys. And so you're going to measure the distance of these things, and you will write those distances down, okay? The final thing you can do, if you're there in the afternoon, it might not be so accurate, but you could spend a few minutes just birding at this site and write down what birds, maybe in a little corner, what birds you observed, because many of them are likely to be there on the day of the survey. They may have territories in the area. So that can be a really useful thing to do. So that's the kind of information to include on your scouting trip. On the day of the survey, you'll be ready. And the first thing you'll do on the day of that survey is write the basics in of a field notebook entry. And this includes some detailed information on your location, your habitat, and your climate data that's pretty specific. You'll update it on your sheet, just little bits of that data afterwards on your sheet. And then you're doing a 5-minute time count. So you're going to want to have your smartphone on you, okay? And you're going to start your survey with your timer, and you'll also start your audio recording, and you'll do your 5-minute count. I'd say start orienting yourself to north on your map, and slowly, very slowly, you know, spend some time focusing in all the directions, okay? And you'll mark your birds in there. Once your survey is done, you stop your recorder, you stop your timer, you fill in the sheet just so that you know the birds you've written down, the names are clearly written, so that when you get back in, you can accurately type in what you observed. Because often you're doing really rapid writing when you're taking your survey, and it doesn't take long to not be able to read that writing when you come back. So just make sure it's neat enough to read before you move on to your next point. So a couple of things I haven't yet touched on is collecting some of this environmental data. Probably the most important thing you need is some tool to help you measure distance. Some of you may know your pace really well and can estimate that. Some people who have worked in forestry have also gotten some good tools for measuring tree heights, and people can share those with each other. There are some tools that we have, some in abundant supply, some in very limited supply, that you can use. This is the very old school way to measure out your distances. I've actually done this. I did this as part of my PhD work. I did distance sampling, and I used a 50-meter tape. And so I'd make really detailed notes on where the birds were, and then I would either attach this to some kind of, tie it onto something, or if I was lucky enough to be working with somebody, I would walk it out to all the places and note my distances. It's very accurate. It's actually the most accurate way to measure distance, to measure this straight line distance, okay? And so it's always important to try and keep your tape measure as straight as possible. And even if the bird is up high, you're measuring it in this straight sort of line. You're not measuring it along that angle. So we have plenty of these that people can check out and use. What I'll say is you can also do this and at the same time measure your pace. So walk a few paces and measure it each day, and you start to become very good at visually estimating these distances. Then you can confirm 2 or 3 of them with your 50-meter tape, and you don't necessarily have to confirm each one. We have a very limited supply of these. These are great. They're laser rangefinders, and they do all sorts of things. But one thing they can do is measure this straight line distance, no matter what angle you're aiming at. They have some limitations. They can't measure distance on the water very well. They can't measure really far distances very well. And on like misty mornings, there are certain mornings where it's hard, or certain conditions where it's actually hard to get this working correctly, because what it uses is a small laser that bounces off of the thing you're trying to measure. And that differential in time from when you push the button and where the laser bounces off your object gives you your estimated distance. So if the laser is bouncing off of something that you're not wanting it to, you're getting an inaccurate estimate of distance. That's why I often recommend people know their pace or know some other way to gauge whether the laser rangefinder is working or not. And so to do this, I make sure I'm in mode 1, meters, because mode 1 is the mode that gives me this straight line distance, and it doesn't give me the distance. It gives me a straight line distance like this, no matter whether I'm aiming high or low. So for example, I can aim at this aspen tree, and it's telling me, and I usually do it a few times before it's telling me that tree is 7.2 meters, which makes sense. I can also aim at the top of the tree, and it's saying that the top of the tree is 6.4 meters. So I will do that again. And part of that could be because, here I'm aiming at the trunk a little bit lower, 6.9. So I'm within a reasonable range of error there. And so it's giving me, if I were to set this on the line of the straight line mode, that would be much further than that. And so you can do this. You can estimate your distances and estimate your locations of things using a rangefinder that you do on your scouting trip, and you can also estimate your bird distances. So we only have about 4 of these. I might be able to dig up and repair. I have a 5th one that people could check out, and perhaps if people are really conscientious about this, more than just 5 people could check it out. We could take turns with it. The people that would have to bring it back the day after they check it out. So we can work out something about that. So there's plenty of 50-meter tapes. The other option is to use an app on your phone. There really aren't that many great apps for this. Golfers use range finding apps on their phones, but they're using those because there are layers. You can actually say which golf course you're on, and there are GIS layers that you can then use your phone very much like this laser rangefinder to find your distances. For natural habitats, it's much harder. There are a couple of pay apps that I've heard are good. I got one of them and tested it out. It's called Theodolite, and it's okay. It looks kind of like a rangefinder. And if I want to measure distance, that's Theodolite, I have to select an option here, and I actually have to walk to the object, and it will then tell me how far I've walked. Okay, so it doesn't really work like a rangefinder, but some people might be interested in it. I did find a free app called Field Measure, and it's pretty useful. And it also is using GIS. So it has my location here, and I can measure as long as I understand where I am on a map. And so here I'm in a house, and I could say I want to measure myself, and I just push where I want to measure, where I'm standing. And then I say, okay, I don't know how far I can zoom in. I can't zoom in. Oh, I can zoom in fairly far. I want to measure to the edge of this fence line, and I can actually put my hand where I want to measure, and it will give me that measurement. So as long as there's a good layer and you can zoom in, that app called Field Measure is actually pretty useful to use. And then, so those are some great estimates for measuring distance. There is another application that could be useful if you need to measure canopy cover. You may just estimate it. And I recommend that people just make a circle with their hand and estimate canopy cover in 3, 4, or 5. The more locations you do within your 50-meter radius, the more accurate it's going to be. But there are a number of apps that use your camera on your phone. This one I have is called Canopy app, and it's free. And you basically, you have to level your phone. There's a process where you level your phone, and then you actually have to aim your camera this way. You can't use the facing camera. You have to use the camera on the back. But you get it level, and then you take the picture, and then you go through a process of telling the app where the canopy is. And you don't have to select the whole canopy, but you put your finger on a few places where you're seeing canopy, and then there's an automated process that it uses to estimate. It fills in the rest of the area that it thinks is canopy, and you can confirm that. And then it will give you a percent canopy cover estimate. It's pretty quick and useful. So those are some tools, hopefully, to get you started on this process.